Hey everyone, we're gonna start in about 1 minute. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Egbert Vongmalaitong, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Commerce and Publications here at the ICA. And there's so many great activities that are happening tonight. The base market that's right outside these doors, this program. I know that there's a poster show that's happening on Broad Street, so thank you all for being here. I have just a couple of housekeeping notes to make. If you at any point need to leave the auditorium, please use the exit that's at the very top to your right. There are bathrooms that are on the top floor and the ground level of this building. Ebony and I met like 2 months ago, and this was shortly after the first iteration of the Richmond Racial Equity Essay Summit here, hosted here at the ICA. And something that surfaced in our conversation in this Zoom meeting was actually a question from the Q&A that was like, what are the next steps? And it's not an easy question to answer because the answers are very nuanced. And tonight's program is, in a big way, a part of the process of asking some more questions, maybe some more specific questions, surfacing some ideas with each other. And it's really, truly an act of collaborating. And that's a big way to move work forward. So Ebony, who has been so deft in moving this work forward, I feel so honored to be introducing you tonight. Please help me in welcoming Ebony to the stage.
Good evening. Y'all can do better than that. Good evening. See, that's better. It's Friday. I know y'all had a long week, but hopefully we can get some good amount of energy here in this room. Thank you, Egbert and the ICA, for hosting us again for part 2 of our summit, where we'll be focusing on solutions this evening. My name is Ebony Walden, the creator and co-editor of the Richmond Racial Equity Essays. Excuse me. In my day job, I like to say I operate at the intersection of race and place. I'm a mix between an urban planner / DEI consultant, diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. And then I help people think about how do we create just and inclusive communities. So that is kind of how I came up with the idea of this project. So the world is very different than it was, obviously, 2 years ago. We're at a different place in our awareness. Some of our monuments are down in the questions of what now and what next. And so the point of this project was to ask the questions of what now and what next. So I really just want to, before we get started, thank all of the essayists for joining me in that discussion and extending that discussion with you all here tonight. They took their time and their energy and their thought leadership and put it down on paper, which isn't an easy thing if you've ever tried to do that in about 1,500 words, right? So that was my stipulation. And also we had, basically it manifested in 50 people. We asked what was their vision for racial equity and how did they get there. So there was essayists, there were people that we interviewed, there's a podcast. So if you go to Richmond Racial Equity Essays, all of the information is there. Quickly, a little bit about the, if I can turn this on, there we go, a little bit about the project. So the Richmond Racial Equity Essays itself, it's a multimedia project. So like I said, we asked 50 people, that manifested in 24 essays, 8 episode podcast and a 7-episode video where we asked people basically the same questions. What's your vision for racial equity? How do we get there? We try to get people from various sectors, walks of life, doctors, lawyers, advocates, activists, you name it. People that were involved in a project are in their 20s to in their 80s. So it's a really dynamic group of people for Richmond, and it's not comprehensive, and we were just getting the conversation started. So tonight is part of the continuation of that. So So it's my idea, Meghan Gough and Duron Chavis, they were generous enough with their time and energy to be supporters of the project. Meghan helped me co-edit the essays, which you can find online. There's a couple copies of the book if you would like to, the ebook if you want to buy it, or you can download it. Duron was really generous with his time, and he did the videography, so he interviewed the 7 folks, and that's everyone from the mayor, and then I got him on camera as well. So go to the website, listen to the podcast, watch the videos. It's really a dynamic project. So thank you to them for their participation. And these are just pictures of the essayists that were involved in the project. There's 27 of them, 10 of them will be reading upon this evening. So we got a nice eclectic mix, and we tried to get a diverse group as possible. We didn't fully succeed, but that was really our goal, from age to race to expertise and perspective, and you'll be hearing some of those perspectives on this evening. So there's 24 essays. They're basically, we put them, you don't really see this on the website, but if you look at the ebook, they're in topic areas, everything from planning to affordable housing to education, partnerships. I think it was community healing and justice. One I missed was Latino leadership and language access as well. And then what was another one? Building healthy communities. And so they fell in these 7 big, really big buckets of categories. And so you'll be hearing essayists talk about various topics within these particular categories upon this evening. And these are all of the essayists that will be reading tonight. They will go in order. So after I read my essay and move off the stage, they will kind of just continuously be reading. Please feel free to be dynamic. Say, give me some clap when they're done. They need to feel some good energy. If I feel the energy waning, I'll get up here and try to rev y'all back up again. If you ever read to a crowd that's completely silent, it's no fun. So don't be that crowd, okay? So be as dynamic, and they do some really cool ideas. So let them know when they've said something that you like, that you resonate. You can snap. You can be like a black church. We like to hum and all of that stuff. I like to say, speak on it. So if you hear somebody yell, speak on it, that is me. That's my way of saying you have just said something that struck a chord with me. So we want it tonight to be dynamic, and thank for the essayists that will be reading. And last but not least, so after the reading, we'll have a brief discussion. And so one of the biggest questions from the first summit was, what's next? Or that's like, what are we gonna do now? And so I don't think that's my question to answer. That is our question to answer. So we're gonna answer that question together and hopefully continue to answer it. So hold up your index cards. You have an index cards. If you don't, we'll get you some. Right, so there's a white index card. So take out the white one first. So you're gonna hear 10 essayists, and they probably have 20 solutions between them, right? Probably even more. So what I want you to do over the course of this evening, on the white card, right? Pay attention, directions, very important. Y'all say white card. Right, so on the white card, you're just gonna take notes of what are the ideas, quotes, thoughts, solutions that really resonate with you, right? Because you're gonna talk to your neighbor about it. I want you to pick out those things, and it's a good activity for you to pay attention. If you write something down, you really remember it, right? And you're gonna hear a lot of quotable quotes tonight, so write those things down, but really look for the solutions, strategies, and ideas that resonate with you, and write those down on the white card, because we're gonna talk about them at the end. I don't know about y'all, but it's Friday. I can't hold more than 3 ideas in my brain, right? So that's the point of writing it down. And the other 2 cards, I will reveal to you when it's absolutely necessary. So there's some suspense for you. I think that's it. And I will start off this evening by reading one of my essays, or my essay that went in the collection, which is also the first essay. So my essay is entitled Black and Brown Centered Placemaking Rooted in Identity and Ownership. And then when I'm done, feel free to clap. And then Martiza will get up, which is the next essayist, and then we'll continue. Probably about 6 folks in. We're gonna take a quick break just so you can breathe and jot down your ideas so you're not like, I gotta get this down, all right? You can breathe, right? Easy, it's Friday. Let's do a collective deep breath. There you go. So, Black and brown-centered placemaking rooted in identity and ownership. I've seen racial difference written into the landscape of my life for as long as I could remember. I began to notice these differences when I was around 8 years old. As I rode through my working class Black and brown community in Hempstead, New York, which is in Long Island, into Garden City and Rockville Center, which are white communities directly to the north and south, respectively, everything changed. The corner stores, liquor stores, and modest homes transitioned into larger homes with bigger lawns, better shopping, and better schools, better everything, it seemed. That shift in the built environment signified wealth and whiteness, which was quite the contrast from some of the struggling neighborhoods in my community. I went into urban planning because I wanted to see more Black and brown communities with new and renovated buildings, with grocery stores that had healthy food, quality housing, successful businesses, and commercial buildings owned by the people that lived in the neighborhoods. Neighborhoods where Black and brown presence and culture are celebrated, not seen as signs of degradation. This is still my hope, to create a racially equitable Richmond that is absent of the starkly visible differences in streets and streetscapes, parks and housing, services, schools, and business districts between the mostly Black and brown communities in the East End, North Side, and South Side, and those in the West End, wealthier and whiter. What if we had neighborhoods and communities that displayed, supported, and celebrated Black and brown prosperity, rooted in property and business ownership and a robust cultural identity? To do this, we must intentionally acknowledge and address the racial inequities that have become the norm in our community and in our nation. Data shows that wealth, health, school performance, housing, home ownership, and environmental disparities, to name a few, are racial, economic, and geographic. The neighborhoods that are thriving, that are not thriving, are Black and brown and in certain sections of the city. And this is almost in every city in the US. If you can find one that doesn't exist, point it out to me. Black wealth is at an all-time low. We have lost 3,600 Black homeowners in Richmond, and our city is gentrifying. We are far from one Richmond. We are, like most places, a tale of two cities, one prospering and white and the other mostly struggling and Black and brown. I am not sure what we need is just unity. We need to be comfortable with difference, to celebrate diversity, to make sure those that are marginalized are at the table and have power, and work to upend disparities that have before too long been associated with our differences. My equitable Richmond involves thriving Black and brown communities centered on and celebrating cultural identity while supporting ownership and entrepreneurship. We need to create communities rooted in Black and brown identity and excellence. We may not initially be aware of it, but we have created spaces and institutions that cater to and reflect whiteness. What if we also intentionally created Black spaces or other cultural spaces that reflected the broad diversity of our community? What if Richmond had the 21st century equivalent of Jackson Ward at its height, representative of Black prosperity? What if we uplifted Latino businesses and culture in the South Side and in our placemaking? There are models for this type of placemaking around the country. In Miami, they have places like Domino Park in Little Havana, a park fused with art, community, and play specifically for Latinos. Or Homecoming, an art project that preserves and celebrates Black stories and presence in the Hill District neighborhood in Pittsburgh. That's just to name a few. We also need to support Black and brown ownership and entrepreneurship. We know that the key to prosperity in this country is ownership of land, of capital, and of the capacity to leverage these resources. Thus, in order to catalyze communities of color in this generation and the next, we should focus on ownership of these resources. We need programs like Buy the Block, a crowdsourcing platform to support local businesses, to help longstanding Black and brown businesses stay in neighborhoods and acquire the buildings that they inhabit. Corridors like the Brooklyn Park Boulevard, which is very close to my home, would benefit from this effort that would both combat gentrification and cultural erasure. We must be intentional about creating, visioning, and cultivating these places, or the default will be market-driven neighborhood development rooted in whiteness and promoting gentrification, which often has the form of diversity, but not the substance, right? And the substance is the ownership, right? So we just don't have diverse businesses, but we have ownership of those spaces and of the cultural capital and resources in those communities. We must start now unmasking racism in ourselves, our communities, and institution, unlearning its ways and tricks, and being midwives to the new equitable Richmond that is waiting to be born. Thank you.
Thank you, Ebony. I grew up as the only child of my single mother, Lydia Mercado. The man I call Dad is Lou Jones, who has been in a relationship with my mother since I was in 3rd grade. Lou is the grandfather to my children and the predominant male figure in my life. When Lou came to visit my husband and me in Richmond in 2012, he looked uncomfortable. I prodded him on what was up. Then he told me a story. And it went something like this. As a kid, I spent the summers in Hanover, where I would hang out with my aunt and cousins. I would accompany my aunt to deliver eggs to the cafeterias of department stores in downtown Richmond. I remember traveling on the bus to deliver eggs. I remember needing to go to the bathroom, but refusing to do so because I didn't want to go to the colored bathrooms. Because in DC, where I lived, we didn't have colored bathrooms and white bathrooms. We just had bathrooms. As a boy, I couldn't voice that sense of fear to my aunt, so I just held my pee all the way back to Hanover. Decades later, I came to Richmond, and as an accomplished professional photographer, to photograph Douglas Wilder, and I pissed all over Richmond. My dad is Black. When Lou says that I pissed all over Richmond, part of the story, he says it with a sneer on his lips and a smile in his eyes. That day in 2012, Lou told me the only reason he comes to Richmond is to visit me, but otherwise he would never want to step foot in the city. He does not feel like Richmond is a place that welcomes people with his skin color. I realize that every single time Lou comes to visit me, it's a profound act of love, one where he sets aside his childhood wound in order to spend time with us. So here's where I come back to my mom. She's a planner, a city planner just like me. Throughout her career, she's retired now, she worked on transformative projects that profoundly changed how places functioned. As I've grown up, I've seen how the long-term planning projects she worked on led to the complete transformation of entire parts of Boston and San Juan, Puerto Rico. I entered the field of planning because I want to create better places for all people to thrive. Locally in Richmond, my work has centered on creating Richmond 300, a guide for growth, the new city master plan. I find urgency to do this work because I want Richmond to show the world that the former capital of Confederacy can be reborn as the capital of reconciliation and equity. But more personally, I'm driven to do this work because I want Lou to feel welcome and included in this city I have come to love. As defined in Richmond 300, an equitable city is one where all Richmonders have equal or equivalent access to goods, services, status, rights, powers, and amenities. From my perspective as a planner, focused on the built environment, access has a physical component and an ownership component. Physically, we need to expand the opportunity for traditional marginalized Richmonders to live and work near daily essential services. And like Ebony said, we need ownership. We need to ensure that communities that were intentionally left out of wealth building opportunities or where their wealth building was destroyed have priority access to own property, business, and process. And I've identified 4 ways to do that. There's many more. One, in terms of the physical, is rewriting the zoning ordinance, which is what you can legally do with your land. 2, in terms of the physical, is reconnecting the city. Just as major infrastructure projects destroyed strong Black communities like Jackson Ward, intentional and community-driven infrastructure projects can re-knit Black communities and expand connectivity to new parts of town. In terms of ownership, we need to establish more programs that continue to increase generational wealth. This is where private and philanthropic sectors really need to assist. The city of Richmond is limited in its legal abilities to create grant or loan programs that specifically create opportunities for Black homeowners or business owners, because doing so may be considered unconstitutional for giving preference based on race. So we need help from non-government groups to help give capital to these organizations. And then the final ownership one is expanding engagement and education of city planning. The process and planning to solve huge problems in our built environment requires time, capacity, and dedication. And many groups that traditionally do not engage in planning processes, they love their communities and they have really good ideas for how to address the problems in their space. But they lack the time and capacity to dedicate to a community-driven solution. In conclusion, these ideas can begin to transform Richmond into a place where people with traumatic memories of this city can begin to heal and find space in the city. Richmond can work together to create a more equitable city. We just need lots of support, financial investment, and patience. A lot of patience, because the work of physically transforming a city takes time. Thank you.
3 years ago, I had the pleasure of taking a garden tour with several amazing colleagues. The tour was unique in that we went to Revelay Church in the West End of Richmond. Revelay Church is one of the oldest churches in the city, and is also one of the wealthiest. The tour guide narrated the history of the church, walked us through its gardens, and told us the story of the oldest house on the church's campus, which is also one of the oldest houses in the city. The house is as old as the enslavement of my ancestors in this country. The other tour participants were predominantly white, older women, all of whom I'm sure weren't experiencing the tour in the same way I experienced it. As the tour guide told the history of this space, all I could think of was how my African ancestors experienced this place. What stories would they tell? What terrors they face? What their lives were like as they were forced to work in the landscape, the kitchens, and farms of one of Richmond's oldest religious institutions. I distinctly remember the separate door for the help. Alongside my own ancestral evocations, one of the most poignant aspects of the tour was the story of how the land came to be held by these early Virginia colonists. As we walked up the steps to the house, the tour guide explained that King George had granted an astounding 50,000 acres to them. I thought 50,000 acres? The guide said that from the top of those steps, the land stretched the guide said that from the top of the steps, explaining that the land stretched from Malvern Avenue, only blocks from Willow Lawn, to the James River. The entirety of that expanse was given to these white people in complete disregard of the indigenous people who lived there. I tell this story to help you understand the root of why Black space matters. The story of people of European ancestry and Western imperialism, specifically the story of the Americas, is the story of space. White people having it and the power of it to do what they want and create the life they desire upon it. The genocide, forced removal, and marginalization on reservations of indigenous people, the enslavement, discrimination, and marginalization of African people, the marginalization of Asian communities, the exploitation of so-called Latinx people, because before a Spanish person colonized this hemisphere, the people who we say are Latino or Hispanic didn't call themselves that, are all wrapped up in the people of European ancestry doing wrong to every other ethnicity on the planet, using a false construct of race as a justification and a hierarchy of human value that places themselves at the top and everyone else beneath them. Food, climate, and racial justice require land justice. As an urban farmer, one of the most tenacious issues I have faced is that of land tenure. Finding places to grow has been hard work, often harder than the growing itself. After years of growing on land, I've seen landowners decide to change terms, sell their property, or develop urban farms, or develop the urban farms we have grown into something else. In order to fully practice self-determination, people of African ancestry have to have land that they control without worry that it will be taken away. The phenomenon we experience today is that predominantly white-led European urban agriculture profiteers colonize our rapidly gentrifying Black and brown communities in Richmond and across the country. Instead of investing in the pre-existing community, these organizations access their circles of wealth and resources to fund salaries, programs, and those organizations hardly ever put our communities in leadership positions. We aren't given the title to the land, nor the title of leadership. These organizations rarely, if ever, use their power and privilege to disrupt patterns of systemic racism. When we do work explaining why communities do not have access to healthy food, we tell the story of how communities of color were redlined, denied mortgages and finances based on race by the Federal Housing Administration. We tell tales of how African-American neighborhoods were destroyed by the highway system. We tell of how Black farmers were discriminated against and denied loans and other services from by the USDA, plus how their land was stolen by members of the white community operating on local and state levels across the country. We tell the story of how Black farmers have had 12 million acres of land stolen in the last century, and that 98% of agricultural land is owned by white people. We always explain that the lack of food access is about power and how systems were established to deny people of color theirs.
Oh, yes, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Dennis Williams. I'm a teacher in RPS and an adjunct at VCU, and I am also a facilitator of mindfulness at the Inner Work Center. So here's a shameless plug. You can register for my Koru Mindfulness for Men class at theinnerworkcenter.org. But anyway, as I was saying, I'm a teacher in RPS. And after asking the school district leader how to address the habit of white families here in Richmond sending their children to county and private schools, I was told the best way to change this pattern was to make our public schools here better. It was also suggested that I reframe the question to include affluent families of color, since after all, they do the same thing. That kind of accuracy is important, I guess. But most families that have had this habit in Richmond have been white families. Most families who still have this habit in Richmond are white families. And many segregated private and county schools today function as apparatus in the resistance to desegregation and are therefore productive of class, race, and ability-based apartheid. But I don't mean to get lost in the weeds just yet, so let's return to my anecdote. There I was, peering into a Google Meet grid, getting ready to preach in a Denzel Washington-type voice. I wasn't at all worried about paying my exorbitant student loans or losing my job or my credit score lowering. Better, I interrupted. Better is what we've been fighting for since it was illegal for us to read. Better is school improvement campaigns, equal pay lawsuits, federally authorized desegregation, and other such policies for which we have already argued and for which we are arguing tonight. I paused here for dramatic effect. And then I hollered out, "Everybody turn on your expletive cameras." I began again calmly. Better is not a school district made to appease affluent families, white or non-white. The better we need is the better so antithetical to supremacist logic that that logic must reflexively oppose it. You're probably thinking to yourself, he doesn't sound like Denzel, and I don't. You're absolutely right. You're probably also thinking, he didn't say all that to the superintendent of RPS. And you're also right. Most of that exchange was fabricated. However, I did pose the initial question and I didn't completely disagree with the answer it garnered, though I still take issue with its reframing. Our public schools need to be better, and there are many existing policies and proposals that would improve them. But since there is already a vast and ever-growing litany of such policies and proposals, my aim tonight is to make the following points clear. Policies and proposals have been churned out year after year, decade after decade, with at best a little traction, and at worst, a predictable, debilitating, and categorically white backlash. This backlash can take the form of anything from stealing Black land, from prohibiting critical race theory in schools, from race massacres, present and past, lynching, massive resistance, white flight, benign neglect, voter suppression, terrorist insurrection, as we saw on January 6th of this year. But it can also take the form of white families threatening to send their children to public and private schools. Now, from a long historical view, it can be understood as, this backlash can be understood as a social mechanism as persistent as the struggle for racial equality itself. As such, it sits stubbornly between our vast and ever-growing litanies for social change and the oppressive social systems which white backlash aims to protect. And finally, this backlash functions in such a way that if we continue to generate proposals and policies, while never fully addressing its magnitude and its damage, I don't think we will ever achieve equity in any real sense.
Speak on it.
Thank you. Now, these points bring me to a very particular and I think important proposal. White people need to figure out how white people will stop themselves from backlashing while the work toward equity in education or elsewhere is done. And as the chair of African American Studies here at VCU recently put it, white people need to stop trying to save Black people and focus on saving themselves. Because this white backlash is hardly ever supportive or beneficial to white people in the first place. As simple as this one very important proposal seems, it begs a question: what will white people do now at a large and national scale to turn their minds away from an ethos of supremacist, elitist, hateful logic to one logic that is deeply humanizing and compassionate? I'm not sure how they'll answer this question. I'm not sure how you will answer this question, or what solutions you will derive when you do. But at this point, I see such answers and such solutions as the only innovative tools in our kit. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Bekah Kendrick, and I will be reading from an essay I co-wrote with Leah Whitehurst Gibson titled Peace for Communities of Color, a conversation between a Black woman and a white woman on shifting power and the need for radical imagination in the nonprofit sector. White women have more socioeconomic and political power than we like to acknowledge. Because of our proximity to white men and our usefulness within a system of white supremacy, we have greater access to power. Disavowal of this power is harmful. It allows us to equate our experience of oppression as women with the fight for liberation by people of color. Historically, the bodies of white women and our children have been afforded more protection than those of women and children of color when we speak truth to power. In fact, our protection has been used to justify violence against Black and brown bodies throughout the history of this country. But what is demanded in exchange for this protection? For me, it has required a disconnection from my body, from my experience, from my humanity. To avoid feeling, I escape through intellectualizing, order and control, the written word, and doing good. I avoid conflict and defer to traditional authority. I conform to the capitalist belief that success and progress means bigger and more, and uphold unrealistic expectations for myself, my colleagues, and the nonprofits I've helped fund. My way of operating is inherited from my European ancestors and has gone unchecked in my churches, schools, and workplaces where there was too little diversity of thought and constant praise from white teachers and mentors for conformity. Though I didn't build my house, I am responsible for it. For me, this means reschooling, unlearning, waking up to the reality that the ways of being I find effective and efficient, they hurt people of color, and they actually hurt me too. It takes courage to see the shadow sides of what we've been taught is normal. And whether or not we like to admit it, we've been taught not to trust people of color, even if not overtly, through subtle messages surrounding us that showed us only white people in positions of power and leadership. What does it look like to trust Black, Indigenous, and people of color, especially women? For me, this has looked like decentering myself, taking on a supporting role in the organization, and being quieter. It means believing Black women when they say they see injustice and inequity. I may not see it at first, but that's not because it isn't there. It's because I've been raised to not see it. If we cannot see clearly, how will we lead? As a white woman in a fund development role at a BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving organization, my daily work is to release the tight grip of certainty that white supremacy culture offers me and step into the unknown, trusting that what is on the other side will be more abundant, beautiful, and holistic. To check whether I am gatekeeping by withholding or hoarding information and resources, and to be willing to have uncomfortable conversations with other white people, in particular donors and institutional funders, about racism, colonialism, and other oppressive norms that show up in nonprofit fundraising. At Virginia Community Voice, where Leah and I work, we've taken bold steps toward equity and fundraising through the creation of our courageous fundraising principles, inspired by the community-centric fundraising movement. We encourage you to check those out, especially if you work in the nonprofit or philanthropic sectors. And I'll close with a quote from Anastasia Risa Tompkin. A good white leader is a good white follower. If you cannot serve the cause of racial justice from the sidelines, instead of trying to be the superstar or the warrior hero, you're not quite getting the concept of what Black liberation entails. As for me, I still mess up, but I try not to let that derail me. Unlearning is a process. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Meghan Gough, and I'm a professor of urban planning and VCU's Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs. Woo! My dual role as a professor and an urban planner accentuates the importance of problematizing the history of both universities and planners in swooping in to initiate, fix, or otherwise address community issues without first understanding the context and seeking to work alongside neighbors. As academics, urban planners, and other resourced institutions rethink their roles and responsibilities in light of racial justice, we must invest in reparative and equitable planning practices. And to do so, we can consider the following three strategies. The first is that we need to acknowledge, and we have a responsibility to acknowledge, that structural racism is a societal problem. Change is not possible if that problem is not acknowledged. Educators need to play a role in teaching this context and specific ways that race and racist policies have excluded communities of color from home ownership, wealth building, access to educational resources, jobs, and healthy neighborhoods. Organizations and institutions must confront and correct their policies, practices, and norms that create and maintain white supremacy. Scholars, including all of us here, need to play roles in elevating the public discourse around race and racism and storytelling. And a lot of what the Richmond Racial Equity Essays is storytelling, is a crucial tool in that. The second strategy that I outlined in my essay was to prioritize lived expertise. Our definition of who we see as experts matters because it represents the perspectives we value. It informs how we see our own roles in addressing complex societal issues. People with trained expertise possess technical skills or access to research and community challenges and solutions that they've gained through credentials or through degrees and training. People with lived expertise have personal experience with these same issues and offer important perspectives about their own communities. They know the priorities and can share ideas for possible solutions, many of which they've already been working on. The problem is when we systematically elevate trained expertise gained through credentials over lived expertise. Both types of expertise are important in addressing racial equity in our cities, but to make more racially equitable plans, policies, and practices, the expertise of those who experience injustice in our city must be raised up, must be valued, and must be invested in. Which brings me to my third strategy. We must commit to building infrastructure and policies that support long-term and mutually beneficial partnerships. This means that resourced institutions, higher education, researchers, powerful institutions need to commit to the long view instead of rushing into a neighborhood or a community eager to contribute, to fix, or otherwise do their work and then leave. A mutually beneficial partnership is where each group or organization benefits from the relationship in a way that is meaningful to them. Inequitable power dynamics often make this challenging, but it's not impossible. Long-term and mutually beneficial partnerships involve a lot of listening, co-production of knowledge, collective decision-making, and a willingness to share power and learn from each other. So in closing, my vision of a racially equitable Richmond is one in which resource institutions invest in reparative and equitable practices that acknowledge structural racism, respect lived expertise, and are built on partnerships. It will demand intention, possible discomfort, and a willingness to make mistakes. But in looking around the room here tonight, I think we have a lot of those tools that are needed to start working towards a more racially equitable Richmond together. Thank you.
This is good stuff. So we're gonna take like 60-second stretch break, collective, deep stuff, heavy stuff, but good stuff. Just give like the biggest round of applause you can for the first 6 people that have gone. And then I want you to take the last 30 seconds to jot down anything. I'm gonna just go back and then come forward to the essayists that have kind of gone, and so you could see, are there ideas, solutions, things that you've heard these folks say that you want to write down on your white card so you remember and in discussion? And if all else fails, I always have some quotable quotes, so, you know, you can write just my name next to there and all the good stuff that I say this evening. So, if y'all are ready to move forward, say yeah. Y'all can do a little bit better than that. If you're ready to move forward, say yeah. That's better. We are going to the next essayist, Shanteny.
Good evening, everybody. How y'all doing? Great. My name is Shanteny Jackson, and I am an Afro-Latina. And I am a senior health educator with Richmond Racial Health District. And today, I will be speaking about my essay, The Struggles of an Afro-Latina, but also providing you with an idea, some thoughts, some suggestions on how to improve the connections, the racial and social dynamics that we have within our communities. And so to be an Afro-Latina means that I exist in two worlds that are racially, culturally, and emotionally interconnected. These worlds sum up the core of my identity. In this essay, I wrote the following. Oftentimes, the general population identifies me as an African American or a Black, and I love that. However, once my Afro-Latinidad is disclosed in conversations, the narrative slightly changes to a more inquisitive one, leading with questions and statements that challenge my Blackness, such as, "Where are you from again?" "Oh, I thought you was Black." Or, "I didn't know there were Blacks in Costa Rica." To which my normal response is, "I am Black and proud of it, but I just happen to be a Black Latina." I love the diversity my worlds provide. The African and the Latino heritage have had a profound impact in the way I live, the way I work, and the way I play. Our culture and values are organically intertwined. The way we dance, the creation of music, our innovative gastronomy, and religious, yes, and religious and spiritual practices are a few examples of our rich cultural identity. My essay speaks that historically, Latinos come from many different parts of the world. We have unique physical characteristics and diverse cultural experiences. Although some think that being an Afro-Latino is to be an anomaly, they do represent 24% of the entire US Hispanic and Latino population. The American, or actually I rephrase, the African diaspora and ancestral roots are imminent reflections of this rich and multiracial characteristics. Our physical appearance, our skin tones, cuisine, dance, religious and ceremonial practices are just few examples of the contributions, numerous contributions of racial identity and cultural dimensions that being an Afro-Latino is, or those of African descent. Both Latinos and African American, or those who identify with or have African descent, have experienced a lot of discrimination, social injustices, economic inequalities, systemic failures, and brutal social prejudice. It is my observation that by overcoming these challenges, we already establish our resilient framework and survivorship skills. Our narratives should never be silenced. Our voices should be unified to bring about more change and hope in the present situations and to benefit the future generations. This story is accentuated even more in the following excerpt. My racial experiences in Richmond have been filled with mixed emotions. I say this because I had to learn to assertively learn to navigate and advocate for myself while dually representing my roles, particularly to my Latino community that sometimes have to overcome the invisible veil of a society that sometimes refuses to listen. Amen? I spoke up in such a way that the voices, all our voices were heard, and our humanity was seen. To conclude, I would like to leave you with these 3 ideas. First, let us honor and respect the diverse ancestral heritage. In my essay, I imagined it as a cultural, diverse community that welcomes and celebrates differences. They also provide culturally sensitive resources and information of other communities to manage and resolve conflict and foster collaboration. And Equity Richmond invites an infrastructure that supports community and celebrates differences. A great investment, hint, hint, would be to develop a Latino cultural center that serves as a catalyst for the preservation, the development, and the promotion of Latinos, Afro-Latinos, art, and culture. Second, let us open and create more spaces for Latinos and Afro-Latinos to lead and represent our current and future generations. In my essay, I explained that identity and leadership are analogous. Those terms are equal, and in my community, of communities of color, particularly Latinos and Afro-Latinos, these are important aspects in our humanity because that yearns a sense of pride and affinity. They are so critical for the survivalship and modeling mechanisms for the rising generations. Having connections and commonalities with a leader create a sense of security, identity, hope, and admiration. By the way, I'm a Celia Cruz fan. Third, let us create and promote and maintain sustainable infrastructures and mechanisms for equitable distribution of power. In my essay, I dreamed of an equitable distribution of power that removes barriers that hinder personal and professional growth. Hiring and promoting Latinos and Afro-Latinos are a few examples of a sustainable infrastructure that creates upward mobility and diversity of leadership roles. In conclusion, an equitable Richmond is a place where Latinos and Afro-Latinos thrive in terms of cultural celebration, leadership, and power. Thank you.
Good evening. I am Bhagat, daughter of Bhagat, and I am here tonight on behalf of my father, Dr. Bhagat. He was unable to attend this evening, and it's an honor to be reading an excerpt from his Richmond Racial Equity Essay, Massive Resilience and Emergent Strategy for Equity in Richmond, Virginia. My dad was born 2 years after the landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision, when the United States Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional and therefore illegal. Yet, the Commonwealth of Virginia enacted and enforced a statewide policy called massive resistance to block school desegregation. As an educational leader and public school teacher for more than 30 years in Richmond and DC classrooms, he witnessed firsthand the impact of racial economic segregation on students of color, particularly Black boys. When he first started teaching, he started a program called African Males to counteract the inequities they faced in school. They were more likely to receive harsher and more frequent discipline outcomes. They were less likely to graduate from high school than their peers. This continues to be the situation in 2021. The systemic failure of education in racially and economically segregated schools is directly related to structural racism embedded within American educational practices. Race and income predict how well students will thrive in school from pre-K to 12th grade. When schools are racially and economically segregated, the incident of toxic stress, racial trauma, community violence, unhealthy learning environments, unaccredited schools, deficient curricula, substandard nutrition, and zero-tolerance discipline practices abounds. These conditions produce social arrhythmia. Communities out of balance, where disconnection, alienation, and mistrust prevail. To counteract these inequities caused by racism and poverty, transformative cultural experiences, specifically designed to increase critical consciousness and eliminate racist policies, are necessary. Equity is more than access to resources. It's a deep commitment to liberation predicated on self-love, self-justice, self-healing, self-determination, and compassion for others. The collective unhealed racial trauma in Richmond is deeply rooted in historical harms perpetuated by the lie of white superiority. This generational trauma continues to have an adverse impact on schools and communities in Richmond. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois declared in 1919 that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. He described how the value of human life is stratified based on skin color. Black, indigenous, people of color have been subjugated to the collective harm because of this hierarchy of human value, producing centuries of brutality and inhumanity, oppression, poverty, and racism. My father writes in his essay, "I can only imagine what conditions must have been like for the first enslaved Africans who were forced to survive under white domination in the colony of Virginia. To have your address, name, family rituals, dignity, freedom to relate with the environment, and spiritual universe stripped away was overwhelming, shocking, and painful. It's unfathomable for me to comprehend the depths of this inhumanity, narcissism, psychopathology, and sociopath that perpetuated more than 400 years of racial oppression against Black bodies, minds, and spirits. Massive resilience is an emergent strategy formulated to create processes and spaces for interracial and intraracial healing, with a focus on Black healing. Black bodies need safe and brave spaces to unpack the traumatic effects of systematic racism and oppression. Often the souls of Black folks are not provided any reprieve from persistent harm caused by racism. When deep emotional wounds are not addressed on the collective level within the safety of a culturally sensitive spaces, the effects can be re-traumatizing. Black on Black healing requires that Black bodies are free to reclaim their human dignity as people of African ancestry. In the spirit of self-determination, my father is going to organize a special event on May 17th, 2024 to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Next month, he will start training a coalition of community-based organizations in racial trauma healing. That includes emotional emancipation circles and urban trauma. The training will also include an intro to restorative practices, mindfulness, and artfulness. This coalition will serve as a catalyst to self-justice and healing.
Hi. My name is Ashley Diaz-Mejias. I am a pastor with Voices of Jubilee, which is an abolitionist community of faith, and we seek to exist on both sides of the prison wall, which we view as a border constructed by the American nation, and a border that needs to be torn down. And before I start, I want to say that I am sharing a story tonight. It is not my story. I've shared it with this project with the support and at the request of and with some edits of my young friend Jabbar Taylor, whose story it is. And I share it in hopes that one day there will be changes that make it possible for him to share his story in person. And a longer version of this story is in my essay. In the summer of 2020, 2 young men escaped from Bon Air Juvenile Correctional Center. One of them was my friend Jabbar Taylor. When Jabbar was 15 years old, he was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder, malicious wounding, and criminal solicitation, all stemming from a large fight that got violent outside a cookout in Fredericksburg. During the court proceedings, the prosecutor advocated for sentencing beyond the statutory guidelines and encouraged the judge to ignore the mountains of adolescent brain science confirming that youth are constitutionally different from adults in their culpability. The judge agreed and gave the 15-year-old boy a virtual life sentence of 72 years, with 22 years suspended. Jabbar was then sent to the Bon Air Juvenile Correctional Center, where he stayed until the spring of 2020. He then appeared again before that same judge, where the possibility of a sentence reduction was considered. Testimonies from Bon Air staff, teachers, his therapists, clergy like me, and stacks of letters from friends and mentors described a young man who worked hard on his own trauma, worked in therapy to face the harms he'd committed, advocated for others, sought out positive role models, and was a leader and friend. But despite this support, the judge confirmed his original sentence, and Jabbar was sent back to Bon Air to await transfer to adult prison for the rest of his life. Jabbar would wait in solitary confinement as the youth at Bon Air spent weeks under lockdown and in the trauma-inducing total isolation as COVID ravaged the facility. It was under these conditions, just to name a few, that the boys decided to leave. While Jabbar's story is horrific and extreme, we all know that he is not the only one with a story like this. Let me be clear, change is beyond overdue. Historically speaking, these long prison terms were not designed with victims in mind, or for accountability or public safety, or to heal a community. They were designed for the control of and profit off of Black and brown folks, including children. But if we can, let's set that aside for just a moment, and let's consider the fact that even for violent harms, prisons don't work. Lengthy, unrestrained incarcerations for harms do not heal, they do not protect, and they make false promises. It's time to admit that, as Danielle Sered writes, we cannot incarcerate our way out of violence. Mass incarceration is a wide-scale emergency. There are buildings throughout the United States that are overcrowded with Black and brown people. We are disappearing community members. Why are we okay with this? Well, as Ta-Nehisi Coates has said, the presumption of the criminality of Black people is deeply written into the bones of this country. And in so many ways, we white Americans live by this presumption with transparency. There are countless examples, but even when polled, white Americans continue to report an explicit belief that Black Americans are dispositionally more violence-prone than whites, and that Black Americans are deserving of harsher, longer penalties when it comes to violent offenses. Well, some of us might be thinking, okay, so that's some white Americans. What about all of us who are reading the books, trying to do the work? So far, it hasn't been enough to generate any kind of meaningful change. Even when white Americans in our conscious minds articulate anti-racist perspectives, we still live in neighborhoods, go to schools, and make choices with our dollars that demonstrate that there is tremendous work to be done in addressing what Resmaa Menakem identifies as white body supremacy. He writes that this is what elevates the white body above all other bodies as the supreme standard against which other bodies' humanity is measured. Menakem describes the white body supremacy as reflexive, like the belief of a claustrophobe that the walls are closing in. White body supremacy tells us wordless stories that we carry in our amygdala, which is the feeling and panicking part of our brain. And in moments of crisis or fear, our amygdala overpowers the part of our brain that wants to do book groups and post inclusive yard signs. No, I'm talking to myself too. Knowing our history of race and how we are failing to make progress, we white folks should not be surprised by the presence of something deep within us, pushing us to value and protect by any means necessary the white body. In the United States, there is a deep historical line from plantation to prison as a setting for social control and white profit in response to not only Black Americans, but Latinx and Native Americans. And from our founding to the present, one of the distinguishing features of the American Project has been a narrative about rising minority crime rates, then corresponding public anxiety, and then the use of state isolation to control and contain those communities in response. But this direct line isn't just theoretical. It is in the physical land upon which we live. For example, in Bon Air, Virginia, Bon Air Juvenile Correctional Center is built on land that was once worked by enslaved people, owned by Robert Murchie. When Jabbar escaped after being condemned to die in prison, the parallels were impossible to miss. But I know tonight is about solutions, and if I were to offer the one that I believe the most in, it would be this. This is an emergency. We need a whole new system. I don't think that we can fully address equity in the criminal justice sphere until we have a transformative approach to addressing harms that is truly built by all people for all people. But in the meantime, we white folks can acknowledge what drives our broad-scale trust in incarceration. We can face and acknowledge our white body supremacy. Resmaa Menakem, who I referenced earlier, has great resources for this work, which he calls somatic abolitionism, but there are also others. I would also invite you to seek out and learn more from extrajudicial and community-based victim-centered approaches to harm, even violent harms. Common justice in New York is one. Our own Richmond Commonwealth's attorney is beginning to explore this work. Dr. Bhagat is an expert. I want to invite you to explore the fact that a learning journey can be a good place to start.
Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Think back to the last time you were outside, under the shade of a tree, enjoying the breeze, the chirping birds, and the fresh air. Did your shoulders drop? Did some tension leave your body? Did you feel a bit refreshed? There's a wholeness and a calm to the amenity of green space, and everyone deserves access to it. Why? Ready access to parks and green spaces leads to better academic performance, improved cognition, better concentration, reduction in stress hormones, sound sleep, and faster recovery from injury. Research just recently has shown that equitably distributed green spaces promote greater resiliency to COVID-19 for all races. Green spaces assist in faster recovery from all types of trauma, too. From centuries of not being able to breathe and the collective trauma faced by our BIPOC community at the hands and knees of institutions, spaces to breathe are a necessity. Lower rates of diabetes, asthma, hypertension, anxiety, and depression all correlate with access to green spaces. During the 1970s, when Richmond annexed a large part of post-war, during the 1970s when Richmond annexed a large post-war residential suburban section of Chesterfield County, they weren't doing so to acquire existing public amenities like parks. Instead, annexation was used to increase the number of white residents in Richmond to maintain a white majority city council. This unconstitutional strategy resulted in a moratorium on annexation still with Virginia today. White flight took hold, industrial facilities shut down. In these newly annexed areas, residents with means moved further into surrounding counties. A decreasing city tax base led to less resources for public services, from schools to infrastructure to parks. This lack of public amenity persists to this day and remains most concentrated in our census tracts inhabited by majority Black and Latino populations, especially neighbors in our South Side. Currently, our 8th and 9th council districts, which are majority Black and Latino, have the most residents who cannot access a park within a 10-minute walk from where they live. Over 25,000 people lack this public amenity. That needs to change. Achieving a racially equitable Richmond requires us to make parks accessible to all, especially Richmond's Black and brown communities, by focusing funding on the historically marginalized, engaging in community center processes, and protecting land in perpetuity, and enacting policies that protect against green gentrification. Racial equity requires focus and dollars in historically marginalized places first. Budgets are moral documents, and data helps us pinpoint where the most need exists. The Climate Equity Index from our city's Office of Sustainability overlays more than 30 census tract data level points and includes historic and current contextual data about institutional racism. We have the ability to see disaggregated data displayed geographically and act intentionally, and we must. Racial equity requires community-led park onboarding and transparency of process. Community-led and trusted organizations founded and run by Black and brown people have built their reputations and successes on following through for their neighborhoods. They often do this without equal access to funding and minimal administrative support systems. These organizations should be leaders in the process of building community trust and paid rightly to do so. Collaborative grant applications in partnership with people like me at the city can help secure these funds, and budgets reflective of the necessity of this work should include line items for engagement. Racial equity requires protecting urban land now for perpetuity. As explicitly stated in the purpose of Richmond 300, Richmond is 62.5 square miles and is not allowed to annex land. Acquisition of land for green spaces will get more difficult as our population continues to grow. We must act now to buy, receive, and even protect open spaces for the public good. Tools like economic development scorecards and community benefit agreements should be leveraged to incorporate green space as a priority for our neighborhoods when new development is proposed. Partnerships with land trusts should be expanded, and conservation easements should be utilized to make sure new green spaces are protected for our communities in perpetuity. Racial equity requires the acknowledgement of and policy protections from displacement through green gentrification. Green gentrification is very much like regular gentrification, refers to the urban phenomenon of increasing rents and subsequent financial, cultural, and physical displacement of lower income and non-white people following the creation or restoration of an environmental amenity such as a park. When plans for development proximate to new green spaces come through public commissions, committees, and city council, questions of affordability and community benefit should be the standard. Other mechanisms like the reduction or freezing of property taxes, rent stabilization vouchers, and incentives for low and middle income housing creation would also offer some protection. A racially equitable Richmond looks like Black and brown-led onboarding of new parks in neighborhoods and communities where no green spaces exist within walking distance. Community-led creation of public open space is the inverse of annexation, an anti-racist land use strategy that empowers residents to build and enjoy places for the people. These spaces are culturally relevant because culture was relevant in their creation. This Richmond has a better quality of life for everyone who lives here today, and spaces for everyone to breathe.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Jeremy Hoffman. I work at the Science Museum, and I teach here at VCU. And it's truly an honor to be a part of this lineup of essay authors and sharing with you a little bit of my essay called Climate Resilience and Justice in Richmond. When I was 7 years old, I lived through one of the deadliest weather-related hazards in recent US history. Over the weekend of July 12th through 15th, 1995, heat index temperatures, or the feeling of the combination of temperature and humidity on your body, in Chicago, Illinois, soared to over 110 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and was buoyed up over 80 degrees Fahrenheit in the evening by the urbanized landscape surrounding it. Temperatures would sit at over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for 42 hours that weekend. This oppressively extreme heat wave had crippling effects on urban infrastructure. Firefighters were opening hydrants and using the water to lubricate the bridges downtown, so water pressure would drop unexpectedly throughout the city. A few roads buckled and contorted, keeping emergency vehicles from reaching those in dire need of assistance, while rolling blackouts plagued neighborhoods around the city. This heat wave also dramatically changed the way that we understand how social equity and climate stressors interact in our cities. Depending on the estimate, over 750 people died over the course of that heat wave, and many of these deaths were attributable to heat-related exacerbations of underlying conditions like chronic respiratory illness. Moreover, the relative risk of dying during the heat wave was substantially higher among the elderly and Black populations in Chicago. Among these disproportionately affected Black neighborhoods, there was a history of isolating disinvestment and social fragmentation that further elevated the risk of death. Meanwhile, just a few miles away as the crow flies, I was enjoying my family's air conditioning. We bought a small plastic baby pool to put under the willow tree shade to cool us off when we ventured outside. We ate ice cream and freeze pops and used the slip and slide. We didn't suffer heat-related illness or death. The immense level of privilege and safety afforded to me and my family by the social structures that award and protect whiteness at the expense of Black life is sharply apparent in my otherwise rosy memory of the 1995 heat wave. Today, as a white male climate scientist at an institution focused on expanding access to scientific information, I wonder how human-caused climate change, which has already made these heat wave events more common, longer in duration and hotter than in decades past, will further amplify these existing inequities. Any given person's vulnerability to climate change is really just an intensification of the precarity they were already experiencing. I can tell you a lot about your vulnerability to climate change by just knowing your zip code. Climate change simply amplifies the background hum of inequity in our world, which itself is perpetuated by the social systems that protect wealth and whiteness at the expense of communities of color. Exploring these trends and data does not ameliorate the generational trauma felt by present-day residents or achieve equity by itself. It merely shows us how intersectional the impacts of climate change are in the scope of other inequities shaped by decision makers and policies for centuries. So what do I think would advance environmental justice and climate resilience in Richmond? I strongly feel that we need to create bold spaces that other cities have been afraid to offer. Our institutions, as many of the other offers have said tonight, need to acknowledge the city's past and connect with their own history. Our grant proposal budgets need to focus financial support into organizations and projects that are already working to lift up the lived experience of marginalized communities of color in the climate justice planning process, instead of creating needless, duplicative efforts and unnecessary and damaging competition. We must continue the burgeoning trend toward concentrated, intentional community consultations on the design of and prioritization of capital projects that are needed to ameliorate environmental inequities. Many of these strategies, both explicitly and implicitly, are being emphasized in our city's recent Richmond 300 plan, as well as the rapidly developing RVA Green 2050 plan, which specifically centers equitable approaches to climate change action throughout its process. While these plans are great progress, and we should celebrate them as such, we must continue to demand more. Implementing these plans will require coalitions of organizations like those that we've been working with on recent climate resilience literacy projects that understand that climate change justice is racial justice. In my view, centering these values in our climate change resilience and environmental justice work would lead to climate resilience decisions in Richmond that incorporate the values of community members, demonstrably improve community health and well-being, and bolster socioeconomic equity across the city. There's also a way to see that these policies would transform other aspects of our city, such that your race or your zip code no longer predicts your life expectancy, your income, your access to transportation, your summertime temperature, your food security, your propensity to chronic illness, your educational attainment, your credit score, and so on. Thank you.
Whew, that was a lot. Give another round of applause to all of the essayists and their wonderful ideas. This is not what normal people do on Friday nights. I was like, Martiza, I need a drink after this. So thank you for listening. Thank you, everybody, for all their wonderful ideas. So I want to do two things before we go quickly into a quick conversation. I just want to say that, so I had the chance, me and Meghan had the chance to read all of the essays several times. So it's actually lovely to hear people in their own voice read the essay after you've seen them and marked them up and seen them in the new pages, and now they're all shiny in a wonderful book. But a number of things came out of the essays that I'll point to in a second, but I also wanted to just lift up some of the ideas of the essayists that weren't here. So you heard roughly a little bit less than half of them, and so I want to point to some other things, right? So from a personal transformation point, I think that the essays kind of fall in 4 categories, and then I added one, which is up there, which is kind of multi-sector. But from a personal transformation standpoint, Michael Smith reminds us that, important values that like respect of your elders and love your neighbors should be a part of our community engagement and decision-making effort. Oscar Contreras, who was here last time, let us know that we need intentional space for relational and cultural connection across differences. Angela Patton prompts us to change how we view Black girls, to value their lives and contributions, and to invest in their futures. From an institutional standpoint, we had Brian Anderson, who's from the Chamber, who encourages the business community to adopt equitable practices and remove barriers for Black and brown entrepreneurs. Gabriella Teleplan advocates for empathy, empowerment, and linguistically and culturally accessible services for the Latino community. We had, for reallocating resources, Shekinah kind of gives us the Brown Circles model, which is really thinking about how Maggie Walker would have addressed these issues, was to have Black people collect their resources. So new Black banks and other institutions that really say we have to fund our own liberation. And then we have Ty King, Genevieve, and Ben Campbell that point us towards transforming the way we approach and fund public education. And that is a state level sort of advocacy effort that we can all pay attention to and get involved in. And then Danny Avula, Wyatt, Gordon, and Faith Walker kind of lead us towards targeting our health and our transportation resources to the most needed. And that is the most needed toward those that are historically marginalized first. From a policy change, we have Mariah and Heather that remind us that housing policy is really what got us into this segregated state that we live in. And so we have to change housing policy in order to get us out. So we need affordable housing, affordable rentals, not just concentrated in certain neighborhoods, but in every neighborhood. And we need inclusionary zoning so that whenever new development is built, there is affordable housing as part of that. Tanya Gonzalez exhorts us to the local governments to have comprehensive immigration integration policy that centered language access services. These are just a number of the solutions that were highlighted as part of the essays. So if you read them, it'll learn you something. And so I encourage you to read them, to digest them. And I always encourage people to do, there's so many levels in which we can work, and it kind of feels overwhelming, right? But we are all people, and we can be responsible for our own learning journey. And so reading the essays and just taking in the information and being here tonight is part of your learning journey. And so we all can be a part of our own transformation to where could we seek out new knowledge, new understanding, really dig into our biases, our fears, and those are the things, you don't have to do anything, you don't have to go anywhere, you have to do something. You don't have to go anywhere in order to move forward in your own transformation. That is something we all can do. You can read, you can have a discussion, you can transform the way you think. You're not to get all biblical, but the Bible says, be ye transformed by renewing your mind, right? And so we renew, I gotta speak on it back there, there you go. And a little amen corner. So we all can play a part in renewing and transforming our minds and mindset. And so we've all drank the water. This is just not for white people, it's for folks of color too. We have been drinking the water of white supremacy for as long as this country existed. So we have to decode it within ourselves as well, right? The other thing that we do, we're all a part of institutions. You got a job, right? You go to a bank, you are part of probably some club or institution in the community. You can be a part of transforming and changing those institutions. Begin to ask the question that the essayist prompts you to ask. Why are things done this way? Who is not included? How can we shift and share power as part of our organization? So that is also something you can do by virtue of going to work and speaking up and transforming the organizations where you live, work, and play. And then from a policy change perspective, I think we've all kind of have our passions, right? So we heard from educators, I'm an urban planner. We just heard from folks from parks and the environment and climate. We all have different things that we're passionate about, but we can kind of go across sector and say, what is the change that we can do together? Because these things are like interconnected. You can't pull one string without something else. So how can you collaborate with others to go towards policy change, systemic change, and the work that we actually need to do together? And then lastly, we need a multi-sector collective action approach. I like to say we need a comprehensive, multi-sector, intergenerational, intersectional approach to our racial equity work, which is going to take us all linking together personally in our institutions and really working to transform our community. And we can't do it without one another. So I just want to thank all the essayists for reading tonight. You can... So now it's time to have a quick conversation. I'm going to give you 3 minutes. I want to do 3 things. So you should have been, I know people don't follow directions, but some of y'all did. On your white card, you should have wrote down your ideas so you have those already, what resonated with you. On your orange card, like, wave it to me. Y'all can do that at home too. You can write it on any colored piece of paper. See, I won't be checking. On your orange card, I want you to write one thing that you can personally do, either prompted by something you heard in the Essayists or something that one of us said this evening. What is one thing that you can commit to doing to advancing racial equity in your life, in your work? It could be read a book. It could simply be reading the essays. It doesn't have to be something big, but what is one thing you can leave here committing to do it that was inspired by what you heard this evening? I want you to write that one thing on the orange card. And then on the pink card, I want you to write one thing we might do together. This may be an idea of how to move the racial equity essays forward. It may be how to have another conversation. It could be something else. Those are you're going to leave with me. So write large and legibly so I can read your handwriting. But what is one thing do you think that we can do together? What's an idea? It's always about what's next. So I'm asking you, please tell me, what do you think what's next? And if you want to be contacted, put your name and your email address on there, and then we can continue in the conversation what we do together. I'm going to give you a minute and a half to do that, and while you're doing that, we're going to play a little music, and I'm going to get a chair so I don't have to stand up for the next 18 minutes. All right? Vanna, you got any music up there? There we go. Anybody doesn't have, cards? Anybody else need cards or pens? Megan's bringing some around. Card or pen? Let me go get some more. And if you gotta leave early, you can leave your pink card on the table outside. I'm gonna give you another 30 seconds. We can have a quick convo. the song? Hello, hello. There we go. So this is just a quick conversation. My friend Ryan right here. Wave your hand, Ryan. Y'all have met Ryan. Spaces to breathe. Deep breath at the beginning. Park sky. Ryan's one of my favorite people. Anyway, just want to have a quick conversation about, we're going to go through the 3 questions, and I just maybe hear about from 3 or 4 people. Each raise your hand, Ryan will give you the mic. So I would love to hear about some ideas, thoughts, solutions that you heard this evening that really resonated with you. Somebody. I like to call on people. Y'all would probably not prefer that. There we go, thank you. Give this woman a round of applause for being brave. Something you heard that resonated with you, go ahead. And your name.
Oh, okay.
Just your first name.
Okay, they call me Kat. All right, I believe it was with Leah Whitehurst and I believe Bekah spoke. What struck me were the terms wake up.
Mm-hmm.
She used the word, how do we see clearly? She used that phrase.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of being held with the certainty of white supremacy.
Mm.
I think that is the crux. It's like the root, because if you can't acknowledge, you can't change it. And sometimes I believe people who are afraid and in pain choose to avoid.
Mm.
And that's kind of what she described.
Yeah.
Yet that's at a great cost. And it's not just for the white or the black, it's for our society, it's for humanity. And so I think that the clue it gave me was that, I constantly hear, let's have a conversation. And then I realized we've been talking for hundreds of years.
Mm.
And there's really not a lot that black folk can say anymore about. It's written in all kind of ways. It's in all media. It's nothing that we can say.
Mm.
The understanding has to come, the clarity has to come from white folk. And I believe, just like any family, in our family, we don't appreciate others disciplining our kids so much. It's like, I can talk about them, I know, but you better
But
not
don't
say
you talk about 'em, right?
Exactly. Well, use that. If you see something's not right, and you see your uncle, your old uncle, who's been passing it on to young buck forever, and everybody else that would listen in the family line, saying things that are racist, pull them up on it. I think they will be the ones that can hold each other accountable and make a difference. Because otherwise, we're talking and talking, and see, those are the things inherently that will make decisions change in policy and all these other ways that are, affecting us.
Yeah.
So if in their hearts and in their minds, they can get past the fear, I kind of believe and I'm not trying to be funny, but it makes sense that it can seem like karma. Like, when will the hammer fall down on us for all that our ancestors have done? You got to believe something's got to happen, right?
So, yeah.
But we're just trying to be here, man. We're just trying to have a spot. We're just trying to be here. So nobody's trying to harm. There's no retaliation. Just trying to live, trying to breathe. And then to have that taken, it's like, when? I mean, it's like a bully.
Yeah. So the idea
we teach
of white
bullies
folks taking accountability.
Exactly. We tell people you don't tolerate bullies.
Yeah.
You stand up to a bully. But if we stood up in the way that people stand up in schools or whatever, that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah.
So how do you stand up to something like that? And this is just bullying to the nth degree.
Yeah. Well, you start with the people you know, right? So I like to say, actually, Richard Rohr says, transform people.
Yeah.
And so I've stole that to say, transform people, transform communities.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's each one of us doing the work of our own transformation And hopefully we will transform those around us by the light and the new way of moving and being through the world.
Yep.
But thank you.
Thank you.
Other thoughts? Go ahead, one more over here.
A phrase that jumped out at me was one of your dad's phrases of social arrhythmia, of our communities being out of balance, and then some conversation about generational trauma. And it linked back to, I can't remember who said it earlier, but that we're all, that as white people, we're victims in our own system also. We're part of that community out of balance. So that really helped
Resonated
me
with you.
kind of really think of a place to start maybe. So thank you.
Powerful. Maybe one other idea, thought that came up in the essays that really resonated with you. Something new? Yes.
Hi, my name is Esther. I think someone mentioned, well, I don't think, I know, someone spoke to how racial equity is like starts as a story of space. And that really resonated me as an architect, and listening to you and the other urban planner in the room. I mean, I've been thinking about it for so long, but I've been just thinking, and I don't know, I've been hoping to move towards like being a part of a different space, like, different spaces, creating different spaces, but just the fact that like the phrase of like the story of space just really resonated with me today.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, part of the reason why I wanted to do this, and I think it does it well, is, so my friend likes to use this word concretize. And so I think the essay do a good job of making concrete the reality of how race and racism impacts the lives of people in Richmond, whether it's through me, and does that through narrative, it does it through data, but also solutions. So whether you're an educator or urban planner or doctor or lawyer, or what's your perspective, or an advocate or an urban farmer, you can tell us how those systems and your life and your space hasn't been impacted. And so it makes concrete this kind of big nebulous idea that people don't understand, and said, this is how it's impacted me and my life, right? The summer where I was 7 years old, right? And then that reflection. So I love that it does that, and we'll continue to do that. So kind of open the floor. I would love for you to share. And this is, take your time and hurry up. So I would love for you to share, and we're going to do a tweet, not a blog, so be concise yet complete, of either something that you're going to commit to do or an idea you have for moving this thing forward. It could be moving our city forward. What could we do together? So anybody can share, what can we do together, or what are you going to commit to do as a result of hearing these dynamic solutions tonight? What did it spark in you? Yes. And please say your name before you are concise yet complete.
Hi, my name is Kristen, and one thing I will commit to do is share my power. So if I'm in a room talking about anybody, any demographic, any person that is not there, then I will stop and wait and open the door until they're there. And then they can speak. So
Speaking for themselves.
That shared power is what I'll commit to.
Committing to sharing power, thank you. Other thoughts? What are you going to commit to do, or what are ideas about what we can do together to move forward? Here we have another one here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kiara.
Go ahead, Kiara.
Hi. So one thing, I'm a part of the DEI committee at VCU's Wilder School. And one thing that we talked about was making sure that all students are educated just about diversity and equity, because when you're in college, like, that's kind of the last place where you can learn that before you like go out into the world. And so it's good to kind of expose students to that as well. And so I'm hoping that we can start doing that.
Yay, and Kiara was one of the students in my diversity, equity, inclusion in the city. So I was like, what did you learn in this course? That racism is a problem. I was like, good. They were like, racism is a problem. I was like, great, you know now. Can't say you didn't know. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mary. And as I'm listening to all the conversations, the current political climate keeps jumping up in my head. So what I wonder if one of the things we can't do together is to identify and support and vote for honest elected officials who are going to move and help us move this agenda forward. And within that, I'm wondering if any of the essayists would be willing, ready to
Come
run
on,
for
y'all.
office. No, I'm absolutely serious, because we can't do any of this unless we have our policymakers and our elected officials and our public servants on board.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe we'll have some people in this room going to run for office.
Ebony for governor.
This is funny. My mother's probably watching and she's like, oh, you're going to be Senate or something. And I'm like, no, that's okay, but you never know. So running for office, other thoughts? What can we do together, or what you're going to commit to doing? Yes.
Hello, my name is Maria, and I'm a master's student in urban planning here at the Wilder School. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about theory, or about the way that you see problems, which helps the way that you solve problems, understanding, how you see the world. When we talk about like giving and centering community, so instead of the normal top-down approach, right, letting the people really guide progress. One of the things that struck me in class, but what I was reminded about again tonight, was we know that community has expertise and knowledge, but we want to make sure the community is supported by money and by resources that enable them to build more community power organizations. So I was so glad to see, for example, Virginia Community Voice being here, and they do such excellent work, but we need more than just one or two Virginia Community Voices. So I think we can all put our money and our support into BIPOC-led organizations like that.
Yes, reallocating resources. They're always underfunded. Maybe one or two others before we go. I would love to hear from one of the essayists, if they were changed, Martiza, or have thoughts.
So one of the big projects that I'm working on is implementing the master plan is related to Jackson Ward and Gilpin, a community that has experienced a lot of trauma. And so I was kind of thinking, I work for the city of Richmond, for the mayor, and I was like, I need to get with your dad to talk about how do we develop a trauma healing, sharing place or process that maybe could exist the entirety of the community planning process because we got a big HUD grant, hooray. We won a big grant from HUD to do a community planning process with the Jackson Ward community and Gilpin. But you can't just, I feel like there needs to be, it can't be like, oh, at the beginning we're gonna talk about the history. Okay, we got over it. Now let's talk about the future. Like, to me, it's like, we'll talk about it at the beginning, but we gotta talk about it continuously. And what does that look like? And who leads that? Because it's not gonna be, it can't be me, like I didn't, so how do we shape that conversation to be authentic and help exist through the duration of the planning process and then inform it too?
I love that, healing. Oh, and thank you, Martiza. There's this phrase I learned from another urban planning friend of mine, which is Shekinah, called, infrastructure, right? So there's infrastructure, which is like roads and bridges, but there's also projects that are infrasuture projects, right? So sutures are what knit things back together. And so how can we have place-based projects that are really not only healing in the process, but the actual physical project is healing. It's knitting our community back together over roads and bridges and places that have been raised by way of healing. And then I say we got time for like two more. So go ahead, Jeremy.
I was going to say, I got to read the education essay, in our reading group, and your your depiction of white backlash to me has truly, like, just reading your essay before and then hearing you speak to it tonight has really shaped the way that I see the white spaces that I'm in, because there's so much of it, and it from different levels of something very simple to something very, like, at the level of school reintegration or redistricting or anything like that. So I'd say, like, I would really encourage other white people in the room to think about that kind of, like, how do you experience white backlash to ideas that hold us actually end up harming us as well, instead of, so I just think that that's one of the most transformative things that I've gone through in this whole process. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Jeremy. So we are at time, so I want you to give yourselves a huge round of applause and the essayists for coming out tonight. Couple of things. So I hope you wrote down a lot on your little white index card and your orange index cards. Those are for you to continue to marinate. Please send the essays to your friends, family, loved ones, because they're designed to read and to hear and to listen. So spread the word. I probably get an email, which is beautiful, an email a day about somebody reading something and really saying, I'm learning a lot. I've been transformed by these. So that just warms my heart. So continue to read them and show them. But I hope that you take your little card or your orange card and your white card and really marinate on that, right? So that's part of what Ashley invited us into, was your personal learning journey. Please leave your pink cards. So Meghan and Ryan and me, we can collect those pink cards, because I want to hear what's the work that we can do together. My name is Ebony Walden. You can email me at ebonywalden.com, or you can also have the essayists are here to answer questions. But let's continue the conversation. I'm open to ideas. This is very iterative for me. Like, if we have some idea of the solutions, but it's not going to happen in isolation, right? It's going to happen us talking about it and us moving things forward together. So I invite you to do that individually within your organizations and institutions, and continue to think about and reach out to me and other folks about ways that we can do it together. Thank you for coming out. God bless and good night. Don't forget to leave your pink cards with me, Ryan, or Meghan, or put them on the podium or outside.